At the time that Glazunov wrote it, concert programs had a lot of different kinds of formats, and a lot of times the concerts for orchestras had a lot more shorter pieces. I think it would have been easier to program this piece back then. But now our programs are a little bit more structured, and I don't want to say it's always overture, concerto, intermission, symphony, but there's a sort of an expectation of there being like a symphony on a program, or if it's a very long concerto, maybe the concerto is the second half. Whether it's a concerto or a dance suite or some kind of incidental music, any piece that is 20 minutes or so is very hard to program because you have to find like another couple of meaty pieces to fill that first half or second half with that piece. It does seem to have a lot of different styles all in one piece. The extensive use of the interval of the augmented second, the opening, makes it sound very exotic and almost Middle Eastern, yet it does, have a very clearly sort of Slavic feeling, melancholy feeling in the opening. It sounds very dramatic at times in the second movement. And in the finale, it sounds very sort of folk-like to me. I mean, there are parts of it that sound like the Bruch Scottish fantasy, parts of it that sound sort of Scottish, Celtic. There's that guitar effect in the violin and with the pizzicato, and so people like Rimsky-Korsakov would also write music that was inspired by the Middle East and other kinds of nationalities and Spanish music and Russian music and a wide range. So maybe it's just part of that school of thinking that, there's maybe almost like a Silk Road kind of philosophy about the kind of melding of different cultures and the fact that Russia as a country spans such a huge geographic zone and that it also spans a huge range of cultures. I mean, when you consider that, in Glazunov's time, they would have also considered parts of Scandinavia as being part of that empire, Consider the far, far eastern side of Russia at the time. The way there are these little sort of counter melodies or kind of responses from within the orchestra. The woodwinds and horn have a special part. Of course, the harp and glockenspiel and triangle are all really special. One of the things that Glazunov does that many other earlier composers had done too was to save trumpets and trombones for being featured later on in the piece. Of course, trumpets play throughout the concerto, but they're really not featured until that moment where they herald the finale. And trombones are actually literally casted until the finale later on in the piece. And so I think that's wise to sort of add a little extra power and strength to the ending. And that example goes all the way back to Beethoven's Fifth, where he saved the entrance of the trombones, contrabassoon, and piccolo for the finale of that symphony. The harp adds a warmth and a lushness to it, especially in the second movement, but really throughout. The glockenspiel and triangle, of course, add sparkle and keep the listener's ears sort of peaked. The glockenspiel does have a really wonderful part, and it's probably used more than you would expect for the year this was written. The triangle was certainly used quite a bit by earlier composers, most notably in Liszt Piano Concerto No. 1, which I mentioned earlier. Because that, like this Violin Concerto, is like a concerto where all the movements kind of blend together, and it's all about 20 minutes long, and it has this sort of organic unity. So I think that there's maybe a little bit of a nod, an homage to Liszt by having some of that triangle sparkle in this piece. That triangle was really overused almost in the Liszt Piano Concerto. The lower registers can be warm. Here there's also sort of a nervous energy from the triplets especially. Glazunov is setting this dark quality in the beginning because overall with this concerto he's going from darkness to light over the course of the entire concerto. Again, borrowed from Beethoven and many others who did this, going from tragedy to triumph or going from darkness to light, per aspera ad astra, sometimes it's called in the Latin. So because he's going to get to a very bright, very jubilant finale, he's setting it up with a very different kind of contrast in the opening. It's almost like he's carefully constructing the solo violin part so that he keeps striving higher and higher and higher in register. And then eventually adding harmonics. The G string on a violin is warm and rich and full-bodied tone. He starts both the first movement and the second movement with this tone. In fact, the andante melody at the beginning of the second movement really is a sort of variation of the opening melody of the first movement. And I think he did that on purpose so that to sort of confuse some of the really musically astute listeners who would be thinking, is this the development section? Because that sort of sounds like the theme of the first movement, but it's not. Again, it sort of plays into the idea that it's all an organic whole. The composer is careful to save the brighter key signatures for the finale. I think this is a really interesting thing that he did. Because starting in movement 1 in A minor, one would expect the second theme of the first movement. You would expect that second theme to be in C major. That's what a normal sonata form structure would dictate, or possibly another major key like that. But he probably thought that C major, so early on in the piece, would be too bright. It would be too much of a victory, too easily achieved. And so he went for F major. It's still major. But there's a little bit of darkness of the flats in the key signature, just a little bit. Much later, after the whole slow movement interruption, the second theme comes back. It appears you would expect the recapitulation of this to be in A major. But he wants to save A major, which is one of the brightest of all keys, for the finale. So he doesn't do it in A major, and he brings it back in B flat major. Just that slight difference up from A to B flat has a totally different color, and B flat, again, sounds a little bit darker. There's a moment before rehearsal number 13 where he offers just a brief hint of A major to sort of plant the seed and keep the music moving forward. And then, of course, there's the whole choice of key of D flat for the slow movement, which is really unusual for a concerto in A minor. But it's brilliant and daring, considering the fact that string players don't usually favor keys with a lot of flats. Because of the tuning of their open strings, a lot of violin concertos and other concertos for string instruments are usually in D or A or G or so forth. And it's because those are the strings that are going to ring very resonantly on their open strings. But playing in a lot of flats is actually hard for strings. Glazunov, who would have known all this as a composer as well as, I think, a string player himself, chose to do the second movement in that sort of dark, personal, almost romantic key of D flat. The first theme seems Slavic and nervous at times, searching and unsure. Almost rambling at times. Yet, at the same time, it's sort of insistent. There aren't very many breaks for the solo violin, and the music keeps striving higher and gets a little bit more excited and passionate. The second theme seems more playful and personal, almost like it's flirting, more intimate manner. It gets carried away a bit before rehearsal number 6, where it starts to descend very dreamily. But overall, the second theme is sort of like a relief of the dark, melancholy feeling from the opening. He's setting up this drama of moods in the first movement, which is really not resolved until the last movement. The contrast of the two themes makes me think of the many masks that we wear, and the many things that are going on in our hearts and minds that can be there at the same time. You can have this sort of tragic, melancholic feeling, and yet there's a whole other side of you, another sort of chamber of your heart or silo, that you have this flirtatious, loving, sort of personal side. The form has, for the past 100 years, confused many people, and it still does. Concerto usually has 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. There are many, many examples of that, and of course there are many examples of ones that have more than 3 movements. A symphony, by contrast, typically would have the 4 movements, and the difference being the inserted scherzo movement or minuet movement or so forth. The scherzo-like quality at rehearsal number 20 reminds me that, or makes me think that perhaps Glazunov even wanted us to think of this as a sort of unified 4-movement structure. The whole 1-movement structure, as well as the quote-unquote interruption of the slow movement, that strikes me as being interesting in the context of the Romantic period as a whole, because a lot of Romantic authors and composers and artists even were fascinated with the idea of the fragment, something that wasn't fully enclosed, something that was sort of left off with ellipses. This also came out of their fascination with nature in general, and things that are a closed-off structure, but a more organic structure. A lot of Romantic composers and authors and so forth were also interested in the idea of bringing a memory back from something earlier in a piece. return of the first violin theme would have to be in the low register, as it was in the beginning. But the interesting thing for me is Glazunov's choice of viola and bassoon, as opposed to having maybe the orchestra section violins play it on their G string, or even cellos. It's worth noting that Glazunov has nice parts for the violas many times in this concerto. And when I say nice parts, I'm talking about sometimes very, very short little things that pop out of the texture, but that seem to really highlight the viola sound. Even though the finale is close at hand, there's still trouble or turmoil that's not yet resolved. Glazunov sort of works through some of the issues, so to speak, some of the troubles through this cadenza. He was smart to do this. A flashy, joyous cadenza at this point would have taken away all the steam and joy and sense of arrival out of the finale. The separation between soloist and tutti gives way in the finale. Soloist's quarter note on beat 2 is the last moment of, quote, solo voice before the orchestra and soloist end together. This is very much like the end of the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, almost identical. The finale movement sort of set up the contrast between soloist and orchestra more distinctly than the earlier two movements. There's a drama there. And so he's playing on that drama right up until the very last bar, of having them play separately, play together, play just the violin, just the orchestra, and together, and then, a brief moment of just the violin, that solo voice, give attention to the soloist one last time, and then crash, they all end together. Another thing interesting about the final bar is that this is the only time in the entire piece where he saves the effect of having the entire orchestra and soloist play in unison with no chord tone. This is often used by composers to signal the very end of a piece. He ends with everybody on the note A. And this is not something completely innovative by Glazunov, and many other composers, Mozart and Beethoven and others, use this technique. But I found that it was very wonderfully crafted, the way that he saves that effect for this moment in the piece.